handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman, Seat, over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder, Seat, out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2-1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4-7 tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds AGPT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience, heard on Mojo 50 worldwide. I have Jarrett Stepman with us, who does remarkable work, a previous guest on the Denise Simon Experience, but he posted an item over at the dailysignal.com that we're going to discuss, because Jarrett went on a field trip earlier in the month. And I would almost argue he needed combat pay to do it. But with that, welcome, Jarrett. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, thank you very much.
First of all, you went to Chicago. And then while you're in Chicago, you went to a conference called Socialism 2019. Now, Jarrett, were you like trolling websites to know that this was going on, or did you just happen to get an invitation to attend Socialism 2019?
Well, actually, I initially learned about this from a colleague of mine, Dr. Lee Edwards, who's a historian who knows quite a bit about communism, the Soviet Union, and he has known about these conferences which take place annually every year, and suggested that I attend the conference and actually see what the socialists at the Socialism 2019 conference have to say. I think I discussed this with my editors at Daily Signal, and I think we decided that it is actually important, especially as many Americans today say that they like socialism or they prefer socialism to capitalism, to actually find out what these people believe. Of course, I would have preferred it not to take place on the 4th of July weekend, which seemed to be a little bit of, I think that was kind of intentional, but...
Goodness. Well, they had, did they have like breakout sessions, like go over here to this particular conference room, we're going to discuss no borders, or go over here to this one and we're going to go discuss, healthcare? I mean, or was it just one big, huge room and they just had all these speakers?
No, they definitely had breakout sessions. In fact, I mean, they had one that was the socialist case for open borders. They had one that was promoting socialized healthcare. So they had all these different breakout sessions, and it was a very interesting experience. Of course, the event took place in the Hyatt Hotel in Chicago, which is a very, very nice locale. It was interesting actually going to the sign-up desk, and they had all these little stickers to identify your gender pronoun, and they had about no kidding, they probably had about 30 different various pronouns to identify oneself. I did not pick out any of the stickers for myself. And it was very interesting. It was a very interesting experience. I mean, they actually, apparently they got the Hyatt Hotel to change the bathrooms, which were not single occupancy, to gender neutral bathrooms. Obviously, I tended to stay out of the bathrooms. I would go back to my own hotel room, but it was very interesting. I mean, they were very serious, especially about the gender neutral ideology, the transgender ideology, which I think was very big, which I think is interesting, especially given these are, basically radical Marxists, very much tied to communist economic theories, but they definitely mesh their views with the kind of culture war left. I mean, this idea about the no genders, no binaries, transgenderism, things like this are very, very big in these circles, and they're quite serious about it.
Could you tell where the money came from to support this thing? Do all the printing and the renting of the space and, paying for speakers and travel. And I mean, was there some kind of benefactor behind this that you're aware of?
Well, I mean, it was sponsored by the Democrat Socialists of America and Jacobin magazine. So there was definitely some big groups there that were putting this all together. They clearly had some money and part of it, but they had a lot of groups there that I thought were very, very interesting, including a panel hosted by, of all places, Teen Vogue. Actually had a panel at this thing, which is quite shocking. I mean, on its surface, you think Vogue, it seems to be something that's kind of, maybe capitalist excess or things like this, and how the socialists look at it. But it was very clear that they were very much, that the editors at Teen Vogue are very much committed Marxists, and actually had a panel at this event where they hosted several children who were climate activists who were very clearly, frankly, more interested in socialism as an idea than simply, addressing climate change or things like this, which I thought was very revealing. It was very interesting to see a youth-oriented publication that you would think would just be about youth fashion and things like this, actively promoting communism. And I think what most Americans would see is the very radical things. But, this was a group that was aimed toward changing the minds of children and the minds of adults who, of course, they use many of these children to promote their kind of activism. And for them, abolishing capitalism is that's the number one target for them. So it was very interesting to see these kind of groups that kind of gathered at this conference. It's amazing that more attention hasn't been put on some of these groups as far as their radical views, because they certainly were. I mean, they were all quoting Karl Marx. They were all speaking favorably of communism. They made very little distinctions between different kinds of socialism, things like that. I mean, these were committed Marxists.
How many were in attendance? Are we talking 500 or 1,500?
More like 1,500, I think, maybe even more than that. It was a well attended conference. I mean, it was very crowded, and the breakout sessions I went to were all full. Were all packed. It was hard to get an exact number on how many people were there, but it wasn't a small event. I mean, I think that's, and I do try to convey that in the article I wrote for Daily Signal. I mean, I think a lot of these people feel very much energized. They feel that their moment is coming in America. Now, obviously, a lot of their views, I would say, are still fringe, and I do hope that I open some eyes to people who may even say that they identify with socialism about what socialism really is, because the ideas that were at these conference were very, in many ways, anti-American. They were very much against the things that have built America into what it is. And I think that they represent something quite radical and something extreme. I mean, we had people there who were talking about abolishing the family and things like this. And for people in these circles, those seem to be mainstream views. They see this kind of the moment we have right now, especially the identity politics of today, as kind of their gateway into the mainstream of American politics. And while I think there is a distinction between them and a lot of other, I would say, Democrats, I think that they are trying to nudge the American left in their direction. I think that they've been successful.
Yeah. Now, were there PowerPoint presentations and handouts and pamphlets and, that kind of thing that, were part of a, goodie bag for attending or in any of the breakout sessions?
Well, I mean, they did. They didn't have PowerPoints of this thing. They didn't have projector screens, but they did have a lot of people handing out various pamphlets for their local socialist activities. They had adorned on the walls posters. A lot of them were depictions of Karl Marx and things like this. The theme was very much red. It definitely was not Republican red. It was definitely there because a lot of these people were committed communists. I mean, there was one individual on a panel who was referring to his fellow comrades. In fact, it was actually kind of humorous because he was apologizing that there were no female comrades on the panel, and he went into this long apology for the fact that it was actually 4 men on the panel, and basically made an excuse about logistics or something like this, and said it was too difficult to get a woman to speak on what they were talking about there, which was organizing communist politics in other countries, many of them in South America. So it was very interesting. I mean, it almost sounds like something out of the Cold War, or almost a joke. But
I mean, it's almost like worse than Cold War. Yeah.
But I think I do try to communicate, and I think that's something that I very much observed, is that a lot of these people have tried to make their ideas pertinent to what's going on in 2019. I mean, I don't think they saw the Cold War and the end of the Cold War as the final answer on these issues. I mean, these people really believe that, I mean, it's almost become cliche at this point, but real socialism or communism hasn't been tried yet, and they're giving it another go. I think they have a unique twist on it, especially with the identity politics that has become very much a part of their movement. I mean, they are big on other issues, I think, that are becoming, for especially many on the left, mainstream. I mean, the idea of a borderless society, destroying national sovereignty, that's something that's become very common on the American left now. That's something that these people at the Socialism Conference are very excited about. I mean, they definitely want that. They definitely promote that. They see it as a way of abolishing capitalism and changing American culture to basically be more in line with their views. And I think that they feel that they have had a lot of success, and they popularized their ideas to a point where especially many young Americans will actually embrace them.
This is an annual conference. Is it always held in Chicago, or just this year was in Chicago?
This year is in Chicago. I believe they hold it in other cities. Chicago, there does seem to be a lot of networks that work there in Chicago, various socialist organizations. But it's a pretty big conference. I mean, there was a lot of big names that were attending this thing. As I said, Teen Vogue was there, which is I still think is a little shocking.
Very shocking.
And to a certain extent, I think what made me a little angry, especially going to this Teen Vogue panel, was they had 2 young climate activists who have had a lot of favorable press. I mean, one was from the Sunrise Movement, which became kind of famous lately for harassing Senator Dianne Feinstein to try to get her to push the Green New Deal.
Oh, yeah.
If you remember that. And
I do.
That in those reports, very little was covered about the socialist leanings of the organization. Another one was a young girl who was promoted the U.S. climate strike for basically children and students to step out of their classrooms to promote policies to address climate change. And when she was asked, what are the things that you want to change to address climate, she says, well, let's move on to a system other than capitalism. And she got, of course, loud cheers from the socialists there. And she's had a bit of coverage nationally for this climate strike stuff. But none said that she was trying to abolish capitalism. None said that she had connections to socialist movements. And to me, that reflects very badly on the American media. I mean, I think it's worth noting that these people are essentially, I mean, they say that they're for addressing climate change, but when they're really, at conventions with radical Marxists, you have to really question what exactly their motivations are. And certainly, in the case of these 2 young girls, I mean, one of them was literally getting cues from her mother there, which she acknowledged in the panel, clearly being used by radical socialists, whether it be parents or whether it be these organizations. Again, that get very little attention in the media of these kind of things. And I think it is important for Americans to understand, what this is about and what these people are about, and something that our mainstream media just doesn't want to cover, what I think sometimes wants to hide from the American people.
So we have, they want to abolish the traditional, family model of people. They want open borders. You came away with several takeaways. Certainly that they're injecting communism, and they're really using young, a young age group as an incubation, thing. I think that's kind of how I'm seeing it. It grows from there, and then they want to take this whole green movement, but it's really it ends up being not climate at all, but more of retooling a whole economic system. So am I getting some of those right?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially on the last point, it was interesting. This literally happened just days before the chief of staff for Representative Ocasio-Cortez, an open socialist in Congress, basically said, I mean, this was even in a Washington Post article, that the point of the Green New Deal was not to address the climate, it was for economic change. And to me, I observe these things. It's very obvious to me what it's about, and I think a lot of Americans are also on to a lot of what the climate change activists really want is to transform American society and the American economy. It really has a lot less to do with actually addressing anything about the environment or conservation or any of these things. And I think that is something that needs to be known. It needs to be more widespread. I don't think the new green, especially if you look at things like the Green New Deal, I mean, it is a radical transformation of the American way of life. I mean, it does move America to a command and control style economy reminiscent of Venezuela. It's not something that, I know that you get a lot of people, especially on the left, say, well, socialism is something like Sweden or something like this, and they try to make it palatable. But frankly, these ideas, these policies are socialism. They're hard socialism. There's the command and control style ideas that frankly have ruined countries, that have created enormous amounts of poverty and misery. These things were very big. I mean, and these people are very, very much serious about them. And I think that they see the potential for using, I think, a lot of culture war issues to essentially bring those ideas to the forefront. I think, especially with the idea of the oppressor and the oppressed, and kind of those who have grievance against their country, I think they use those views to inject Marxism into the American mainstream, because these people, they think they have all the answers. They think that their ideology is going to create this kind of communist utopia that exists only in their heads, not in reality. And they're very serious about it, and they're relentless. They work on local levels. They work sometimes within the Democratic Party, sometimes from without. And they are willing to continue to push their ideas until it becomes the mainstream in America. And so I do think it's important to pay attention. I think there's some people who say, oh, socialism, really isn't a big deal. We kind of, we won the Cold War, and, it's not really relevant to 2019. Well, it is very relevant, and it's something that I think Americans across the political spectrum should ultimately reject.
Was there any media there, or no?
There was some media there. There was one reporter, I think, from the Washington Post. I saw almost no coverage at all online, which I thought was very interesting, besides my own. But there's definitely some media there, and it got some attention. And it certainly was a well-attended conference. If this was just it wasn't just a couple hundred people and just a fringe operation, because of course there's a fringe thing for almost anything in this country, but this was a fairly big mainstream operation. I mean, they had a very well functioning website. They had obviously they were able to book this hotel. There was certainly a lot of money that went into this thing. So this was not just a small event. This was actually it was a very large one, and they got a lot of big names that went there from the kind of socialist movement in America. And so, some have tried to dismiss, well, this is just a few radicals and cranks. But especially when you really get into how their ideas have become more mainstream, and especially, in light of that, and a lot of the recent polls about socialism, which I think has definitely certainly, I mean, there's a recent poll by Gallup that said that 4 in 10 Americans think that socialism is better than capitalism. It's very obvious why this thing is being more well attended. More people are actually embracing socialism. And I think that for those who don't think that this isn't coming, that socialism has been defeated as an ideology, as a philosophy, I think they're just wrong. I think there are a lot of people, especially young Americans, who many of whom don't really remember the Cold War. They don't really remember, the collapse of the Berlin Wall. They don't know about these things, and they're taught in school that, actually socialism is a good thing and capitalism is bad. You can see how they can be radicalized by people who seem to have all the answers for them.
Well, the fact that Amy Goodman was one of the speakers, and she's the host of Democracy Now!, I believe that's a Soros-funded operation. I think they even have some pretty significant reach on their podcasts and whatnot. They're a much more serious operation than, say, Code Pink, on all anti all kinds of stuff. So the fact that she was there tells you that it is very serious, because I've kind of watched some of her work, and it's terrifying. Did anybody know who you were when you were there, or no?
No, I mean, I signed up there for press credentials. I went to the desk and signed up, and they just showed me the pronoun placards, and I think I blended in pretty well. I kind of spent a few days, didn't shave, wore a red shirt to try to blend in with the red shirts that were sprinkled in throughout the whole thing. I fitted very well. Surprisingly, I was kind of surprised myself. My coworkers are kind of teasing me. Did they convert me to socialism? That didn't happen, but it was certainly an interesting look into something that's become very serious, especially doing this right after the 4th of July. This was 4th of July weekend when I participated in this, and going from the day before on the 4th, which I was in Washington, D.C., went to visit Mount Vernon and place some flowers on George Washington's grave, which is a tradition for me that I do every year. And going from this kind of patriotic celebration of America, and to go from that to a socialist conference with rampant anti-Americanism and ideas that are very much against what this country is about, it was a stark contrast, and it wasn't always easy to sit through every single one of these sessions. But I felt that, hey, people need to know what these individuals are about. I'll take one for the team and spend a weekend here and really try to bring these ideas to light, which, for many of these socialists, they are happy with that. I mean, they believe that this is truly the way. They think that socialism, as I said, real socialism hasn't been tried yet, and they're very excited about this. I think people with common sense should see through, ideas like abolishing the family as something that would create incredible inhuman misery. But these people are very serious about it, and they got wild cheers for insane ideas.
I'm looking at some of the schedules and the breakout sessions, and it's really quite remarkable. I mean, there's a lot of far, global reach in this thing. They bring in Bolsonaro of Brazil. They talk about Iran. They talk about social reproduction. They go back and talk about the Arab Spring and the socialist view of that. I mean, they really kind of covered a lot of things, in these topics and breakout sessions. I guess what's kind of scary is the education component. I think that necessarily something to watch pretty carefully. That to me is probably the scariest part of it all, because we're continuing to, I use the word incubate the younger generation and kind of bring them along and make that whole, seed grow and blossom and seize the planet, sex work and sex trade. Swell. Here's an interesting thing. There was one there called Can We Organize Amazon? I have a feeling with this, didn't we just have an Amazon walkout? That might be, somebody may have taken a memo back to Amazon and decided to organize this walkout for working conditions and whatnot. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking with Jarrett Stepman, who did you need a trophy for this work. Went to the Socialism 2019 conference in Chicago over the 4th of July weekend. I suggest you go to dailysignal.com and read about this. Just a remarkable coverage, and so delighted that you could share some of this and I guess, help us wave the flag or sound the alarms. So thank you, Mr. Jarrett. And ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way on the Denise Simon Experience. Stay with us. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience, heard on Mojo 50 worldwide. Man, I've got the distinct pleasure of having Carrie Severinon and Mollie Hemingway with us. They have just launched their new book. It's on the bookshelves everywhere, Justice on Trial, the Kavanaugh Confirmation and the Future of the Supreme Court. It is an amazing, amazing read and something that's really kind of close to my heart. So with that, Mollie and Carrie, thanks so much for being with us. Remarkable work. I was really quite struck by the photo or the cover of the book because it has Kavanaugh holding his pocket constitution in his hand. And that was a striking moment for me in the hearings because Senator Kamala Harris asked him a question referring to that book that you hold in your hand, which had a tone of contempt in it. Did you ladies feel the same way I did at that moment?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of moments that Kamala Harris was for her 2020 campaign. But I think she overplayed her hand on several accounts. We tell the story of how she tried to do a gotcha moment in her best Perry Mason prosecutorial, like, yes. I think you know which person I'm talking about. And talk about how the White House team figured out that actually she had no idea what she was talking about. And of course, no one ever, after the press went crazy about what a breakthrough moment that was, no one ever called her on that. But I think a lot of people were looking and scratching their heads and saying, this woman is not really playing it straight.
Exactly. And I think that we should take that as kind of a lead as she is out on the campaign trail and all things to watch for when it comes to Senator Harris. I certainly started paying some attention probably around 2001 to policy and politics. For context and whatnot, something was becoming a common denominator, and that was that the judicial system and the network was becoming a kind of a culprit to maintaining law and order. So, Carrie, is this kind of the work of the Judicial Crisis Network, is to kind of begin to inject judges to put liberty and original constitutional text back into the benches across the country?
Yeah, and Mollie and I write about this at the end of the book, too, kind of in a bigger picture. Where are we going? Thought. And it really is, we talk about how the problem with the court, obviously there's a lot of bad actors here, from the senators to the media, et cetera, but there's also the court's fault here, because if you as judges are acting as politicians by other means effectively, then it's no surprise that the American people starts treating the confirmation process as a political one. And we think that one of the best ways to get away from that and hopefully to defuse this confirmation process somewhat is actually if judges would embrace a originalist and a textualist understanding of the Constitution and of the law. That means our laws would be passed by our elected representatives, and then whether they were conservative or liberal, the courts would stick to those laws. Then let the politics be fought in the political sphere and keep the judges out of it. That would be our goal. I hope a lot of Americans would agree with us.
Oh boy. The Kavanaugh hearings were likely watched by probably less than 10% of the American population. That's just a guess on my part. This book, Justice on Trial, in my little humble opinion, watching all things domestic and foreign, it's probably the most productive public service gift to the health of this country, because it's a lesson in history. I really feel that. I think you ladies have done just a remarkable job. Mollie, are the book reviews kind of saying the same thing? This is kind of where, if you really read what's there in this book and the context and the history and all the backgrounds, that it really tells us that you guys did a public service for us.
Thank you so much, first off, for saying that. And we have been just absolutely elated and gratified to see the response since the book came out on Tuesday. And while we're just starting to get some reviews in the press, those reviews are picking up on what a substantive book it is, how it doesn't just tell a gripping story of the confirmation battle that we all lived through, but it places it in context, in history, and also looking forward. So it is wonderful to get those. I'm personally thrilled by the Amazon reviews that we've been getting. There are over 200 Amazon reviews, which, first off, for within a week of the book being published, that's amazing. And people are clearly reading it, enjoying it, and taking different things out of it. Everybody gets a different thing that is their favorite part, whether it's a particular example of bad actions by politicians, or whether it's stories of how this battle affected people personally. We tell a lot of stories about, how this affected the Kavanaugh family, how Ashley Kavanaugh prays that her husband won't get the nomination.
Right.
She knows he's the most qualified and he would be an ideal justice, but she just knows how difficult confirmation battles could be, and she had no idea how difficult it would get. And so I just am happy. We enjoyed the book. We enjoyed writing the book. We enjoyed working together, and we put so much into it. And I think I speak for Carrie that we are just so gratified that it is resonating so well with other people.
Well, I say that it's a little bit of a history lesson because you ladies put in a lot of effort to go back in time to other presidential administrations and talk about, their choices, good, bad, and indifferent, or when it came to Supreme Court judges, and how some decisions were coming down, and where I don't think we have short memories because we live in the moment anymore in America. And so when you go back in time, it becomes very important to go, oh, that's when that happened. That's when. And so I almost believe that this ought to be taught in civics class if we teach civics classes anymore in school. Did you ladies feel like you were imparting some good portion of major history and how culture has changed as a consequence?
Yeah, that was one of the goals that we had. And both of us, really, as we started this, sat down and started learning. We knew some of the outlines of history, but the more we learned, the more we started to see these themes emerging, trying to figure out what is it that makes confirmations as hostile and as partisan as they are. And we really did see that ratcheting up over these years, and saw that one of the bigger issues is not so much even the identity of the nominee, him or herself, but the political context around it. Is this a swing vote that's being replaced in the court? Is there going to be a shift on the court? For example, when Justice Thomas was nominated, and it was Thurgood Marshall, who was one of the most liberal justices, replaced by a conservative justice. So you start to, because we had people who were saying, gosh, why didn't this happen with Gorsuch? Why did it happen with Kavanaugh? Well, that's a big part of the answer. When you're replacing Scalia with Gorsuch, it's not a big shift. When you're replacing Kennedy with Kavanaugh, that is when the court's real center is in play, and where the direction of the court's going to go. And so that actually makes us worried then, of course, looking forward, because we know what just happened, replacing a swing vote with a Trump justice. What happens next time if there is a liberal vote, if Justice Ginsburg retires, or one of the other liberals in the court, and President Trump were the one to replace them? I can only imagine. We want to do everything we can to make sure people are aware of the history, even the history we just went through. It's already, kind of in the rearview mirror. We want to look at it and remember what happened so we can hold people accountable and not allow it to happen again.
Goodness. it seems like two things. There was a common thread, from, years past to going up through the Kavanaugh hearings. There's a common thread of two things. One, it was money, and the other was religion. And those two things got injected. The complicated, not only Supreme Court justice picks, but also decisions. Did I overstate that at all?
Well, I'm not sure, but it is interesting to look through the history and see how different things concern people at different times. One of the things that is undoubtedly true about recent decades is that much of the drama over Supreme Court nomination battles is related to abortion. And the Supreme Court itself is responsible for that because of how it has handled its abortion jurisprudence. It is one thing for people to vote to change laws on a sensitive topic like that. It's entirely another to discover in the hidden contours of the Constitution something like a claimed right to abortion. And so ever since that decision, you start seeing these social issues becoming a big driver of politics in the nomination battle. And it's not surprising that they are, because when the court behaves in a political fashion, it becomes a more political process. Confirming nominees is always a political process by virtue of the fact that it's literally political. You're voting on whether or not to approve them. But there are ways to keep the integrity of the court as a higher value than we have seen in recent decades. And we look at that when we're thinking about the different people who are responsible for the pain and the problems of the last year. Yes, the Senate had some players who behaved irresponsibly, so did the media. But the court itself needs to remember its proper role and to not go beyond that role, to just say what the Constitution says and not invent rights or otherwise go over the will of the people.
Very well said, for sure. You ladies weren't really planning on writing this book. It just seems the message is that there were hundreds and hundreds of people that were working to replace this seat, and there were a lot of names that were injected, and everybody's got a story to tell. So it's kind of like they kind of tapped you ladies on the shoulder and wanted to tell these stories. So you were really, sounding the grace of all of these unsung heroes out there that were working at this. Is that right?
Yeah, that is really actually how this came about. And Mollie and I both, we had followed this closely. Mollie was covering it in detail as a journalist, and she had people who were speaking to her. I was working on the nomination as an activist trying to advance it. And so we both knew there were a lot of stories out there, and there were stories that had not yet done justice. And we knew we had a great access to the people who had those stories to tell. So we felt we had a real opportunity to lay down the actual story and the record of what really happened here. And, I was someone who worked for Justice Thomas. I've seen what they have done to him, and they didn't just pack up and go home when they weren't able to use smears much along the same lines as this to block his confirmation. They continued it. They want to discredit everything he does in the court. They continued a refrain of misinformation and revisionist history. So we also felt like we need to tell those stories so people understand the courage that it took to get Justice Kavanaugh confirmed and understand the real stakes at hand. And it was some really beautiful stories of courage on all fronts.
Courage is a great word, and it was almost like free courage because there are so many that we don't necessarily understand that work in support of justices, wherever they may be. Any judge, that they have such a fealty for law and for the Constitution that they were willing to, lose their jobs. They were willing to do these things in an unpaid condition in order to preserve, or maybe not preserve, restore where the Supreme Court needs to be.
That is absolutely true. We learned so much about people who are around Brett Kavanaugh, either professionally or personally, who were willing to sacrifice so much. He had built up a base of incredibly loyal law clerks over the course of his 12 years as a federal judge. These were people that he continued to nurture and mentor and keep in close contact with. So they actually were responsible for getting him on the short list of the White House. They were pushing him because of their love for him. And then personally, over the course of decades, because of the way he had lived his life and treated other people, he had so many close friends who were willing to speak on his behalf when things got rough, even as it became at great personal cost to them. The media environment where people were being absolutely vilified for saying anything in support of him. And they, these are people in sometimes high level positions where they are risking a lot professionally, or they are people who just are nervous about how it can affect them in the community. But they felt that that if anyone needed defense, it was someone like Brett Kavanaugh. And so they came out and defended him.
Watching the hearings, it's almost it's almost as though there isn't anybody that we necessarily know personally that's as good and genuine of a man as Brett Kavanaugh. And it's almost as though those that opposed his nomination were trying to take away his decency. They were going to find anything, and if it really wasn't there, they were going to manufacture it. This is a kind of a cloak and dagger operation that goes on in DC. We outside of the Beltway, we look back at this and we see this whole kind of cloak and dagger tactics. So the other part of your book, I would say, is doing a service to the reader, saying, we're asking you to look at things that go on inside the Beltway in a different light, because this cloak and dagger stuff goes on all the time. Is that overstating it, Carrie?
Yeah, we definitely found a lot of really interesting information about how the attacks on Kavanaugh were coordinated. Things that we kind of suspected at the time but didn't have the evidence for then, in terms of the fact that this is not an effort that just kind of happened organically. There was a real public relations rollout. We definitely suspected that there were Democrats that were working hand in hand, and they certainly seem to be reading off of the same playbook. And that later, in our many interviews, we talked to more than 100 people for this book. From the president to Supreme Court justices and senators on down. There were people who said, for example, they overheard Senator Harris talking about coordinating Blasey Ford's outfit she wore to that second hearing with one of Anita Hill's outfits that she wore, saying, "Oh, it was so great that we had her wear that blue dress because Hill had worn a teal dress." They down to she asked for caffeine during the hearing, which some people thought sounded kind of funny. Like, why do you say I need caffeine? And then someone brought her coffee, and she didn't want coffee. She only wanted Coca-Cola, and that was apparently to elicit analogies to the unsupported allegations about Justice Thomas that had to do with a Coke can, and it was very scripted and organized. And that was, I think we just need to go in with our eyes open sometimes, looking at some of these things, and unfortunately have to have our antennas up and realize that sometimes you have to have a little bit of a grain of salt as you're watching some of this political theater.
Mollie, it was choreographed. I mean, they mobilized so many people and organizations with the protests hanging out at the Kavanaugh house or somebody else's house, or hanging out at the Supreme Court, or walking up and down the halls of Congress. I mean, in the roving protests walking up and down Pennsylvania Avenue. I mean, there had to be some kind of a grand marshal of this choreography. In other words, was there a single culprit or plotter that or was there some kind of a war room?
There was central coordination, and it was obviously a well-orchestrated campaign. It almost worked. I think people who are aware of the political moment looked at what was going on and could sense that it was organized. And as Carrie has noted, they were sometimes proud of talking about it. There were some central organizing groups right within minutes after the nomination was announced. There was a protest on the steps of the Supreme Court where I think 30 or so groups came together to denounce the nominee, whoever it would be, and it turned out to be Kavanaugh, so they were denouncing him immediately. And that was organized by the Center for American Progress. But if you look at all the various groups that were brought in to coordinate this anti-Kavanaugh messaging, they were all funded by one organization called Arabelle Advisors. And so we look a little bit into that in the book at how they operate, how coordinated they are. And it can give the appearance that it's a larger group when you say, oh, there are these, dozens or hundreds of organizations, all with the same funding, all brought together and given marching orders about what to do. I think people who went through the Bork and Thomas hearings remember seeing these types of coordinated efforts, and they were more aware of what they were witnessing with Kavanaugh. And it's one of the reasons we wrote Justice on Trial, so that people would know their history, know that this was a coordinated effort, and just kind of recognize it when they see it next time.
Ladies, there was some criminal referrals as a result of this hearing. I think Senator Grassley put in a couple, maybe Senator Ben Sass. Where are those criminal referrals today? Do you know?
So these are referrals for people who brought allegations against Kavanaugh out into the public or brought them to the committee, and that were just manifestly false. So, one, for example, was a woman who submitted a letter saying that she had been assaulted by him, and later just admitted, oh no, that was someone else thought I found this letter somewhere and it seemed really compelling, so I just submitted it as my own. Things like that. And then the other was Michael Avenatti and Julie Swetnick. I mean, this is one of the big three, as many people saw them, allegations, but clearly one of the more spurious ones. And Julie Swetnick, even in her own statements to the media, et cetera, really backtracked and undermined her own things she had said. They've been referred for investigation and potential prosecution to the Department of Justice. Unfortunately, we haven't seen action on that yet. And frankly, there's probably more people, because there were a lot of these kind of allegations, especially in that final couple weeks of the process, that had all the hallmarks of some people just kind of jumping on a bandwagon and saying things they didn't have any evidence for. And so I think there's a lot of room for more referrals to be made, for actual prosecutions or serious investigation to be done. So we feel strongly that people need to be held accountable, because they need to know, people talked about, we need the FBI to look at this because we want to make sure we get the truth out, because people can't lie to the FBI. Well, people may not know it, but you can't lie to the Senate Judiciary Committee either. It's actually federal penalty as lying to the FBI, and it takes their resources away from investigating real important allegations. And that was one thing that Senator Grassley, who himself is a huge defender of whistleblowers, he has a whole investigative team that really was an amazing asset to bring to this confirmation process, that he happened to be the chairman of the committee and have all of those resources at hand to put on this. But he was saying, wait a minute, when you guys are just writing letters and then you admit that you just made them up not long thereafter, you're wasting all of the time that should be devoted to looking into actually things that could be plausible or real whistleblowers out there. So I think he made a great case for why this is bad for the system in general. If you're crying wolf, or if you're deflecting resources where they need to be for real allegations.
I would say with the Kavanaugh hearings, based on all of the choreography that went on and the chaos and all the Cloakanddagger and all of those other kinds of things, we saw the left really play it out in a I don't know, probably an epic moment during this whole Kavanaugh confirmation process. But then if we look at the Russia-Trump collusion thing, I believe that tactic was already going on, and they were using those same kind of tactics out in the open on the Kavanaugh hearing. So it's almost as though the whole Trump-Russia collusion thing was already in play and was coming to us in snippets and in kind of in the drip method. But it all came in a comprehensive fashion in the Kavanaugh hearing. So it's almost as though you have to read your book, Justice on Trial, and then go back and re-examine where we are with the Russia-Trump collusion Mueller thing to kind of put things in perspective. So I guess the question there is, Mollie, it's almost you've done an additional service to the reader, so we now can look at this whole Mueller thing in a different light. Is that overstating it?
I do not think that is overstating it, and I'm so glad that you brought it up. It was so fascinating to be researching for this book, and the Russia story is actually the other big story I have covered over the past few years. I was one of the very few people who was skeptical of the insane theory that Donald Trump was won because he colluded with Russia to steal the election. But there were things there were similarities I saw, and one of them was, when you look at the Russia collusion story, it begins with these allegations that have a weird combination of specificity and vagueness. It sounds bad, yes, but when it actually comes to hammering out the details, it's almost impossible. There's a dossier of allegations that are rolled out slowly through a highly orchestrated political campaign that is funded by dark money. Well, this is very similar to what you saw with the Kavanaugh situation. You couldn't really pin down any of the allegations. They sounded bad, and the media certainly reported on if they were bombshells. But if you thought for a minute, you would think, what is it really being alleged? What can be proven? What can be denied? I mean, it was a really brilliantly done strategy to destroy someone's reputation as the means by which to prevent him from getting on the court. But I do think there were parallels, including that some of the same figures are involved in both.
Yes.
Kavanaugh got in a lot of trouble for mentioning the Clintons in his testimony, but he was pointing out that there were these figures associated with the Clintons who were involved in efforts to stop his nomination. Yes, he worked on the Whitewater investigation, so their anger at him had deep roots. But the Clintons were also the people who secretly funded the dossier and used their allies to spread it throughout the media and the government. It is interesting to see the parallels.
I swear, having this book, Justice on Trial, is like a lottery ticket, and it's the winning lottery ticket, because it just tells us so much. It gives us a new set of arrows in our quiver for strategic and critical thinking when we look back on all things Washington, D.C. I mean, you've got, I don't know how many pages of citations in this, how many interviews, hundreds or more. You guys just did a remarkable job. I think that this book is probably the single gift for the reader that we could possibly have here in recent history. I mean, it is a true gift to us that we can look back on Washington, D.C. in a very different light. Mollie Hemingway and Carrie Severinon, congratulations on this book. Well done. If I could give you a Peace Prize, a Nobel Peace Prize, I'd hand it to you through the microphones. Just so thrilled to have you here with us. Congratulations for a job well done. Ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way on the Denise Simon Experience. Stay with us.
You can't handle the truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. See ya. Over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. See ya out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, Lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 Tree 5, 9er 2-1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4-7 Tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEPT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. We are heard worldwide on Mojo 50. And I've got the distinct pleasure of having a good friend, previous guest, Gordon Chang, with us, who is the author of The Coming Collapse of China. He's a frequent Fox contributor because of his expertise in China. So with that, Mr. Gordon, welcome to the Denise Simon Experience.
Well, thank you so much, Denise.
Something's kind of struck me yesterday. We have all of these Democrat presidential candidates that are saying we want Medicare for all, we want reparations, we want free education, we want all these things that are going to cost. I mean, I'm seeing estimates of trillions of dollars over, 10 years or whatever that number may be. And in your book, The Coming Collapse of China, kind of reminded me. We could necessarily go much further into debt than 23 trillion. And we do borrow from China, yet China's in debt. Is that right, Gordon?
Well, China has a debt problem. It doesn't have a debt problem to the foreign community because its external debt is actually quite manageable. Its debt is owed to Chinese. And so this is, people say, well, that can't be a problem because, they just owe it to themselves. But if you look back at financial crises, the worst ones are when countries owe it to themselves. And the reason is simple. Because if you owe a lot of money to foreign banks, for instance, as many Latin American countries did, well, all you do is you send your finance minister to New York, you negotiate a reduction in your debt with the bank committee, and you go on your merry way, and it's politically powerful because, you have stiffed the foreigners. You can't do that in a crisis where the debt is owed to Chinese by other Chinese, because then they're going to be political losers. And so that's one of the reasons why Beijing has not been able to deal with a horrendous debt problem right now.
Fascinating. I think that's probably part and parcel of the trade talks between the China and the United States, correct?
Well, the trade talks with the United States create uncertainty, and it makes it more difficult for Beijing to focus on its internal debt issues. But this is a problem which has been growing for decades. So this is really separate and apart from the trade talks, the tariffs, and all the rest of it.
I want to talk a little bit about Google here because another thing struck me about China, and I had to call on you. One of the larger concerns that the United States has with China, and we're certainly trying to impart this fear with allies, is Huawei. Huawei is essentially a tech espionage operation, as I see it. And we are trying to sound the clarion call, even within the United States, certainly all things inside the Pentagon, but we're doing it with our allies. But when it comes to Google is probably just as threatening to national security, if not more so than Huawei. Is that overstating it, Gordon?
It's hard to compare the two, but Google is doing things which are near traitorous. At the same time that it is not cooperating with the Pentagon on AI, artificial intelligence, and cloud computing, it is working on AI projects in China, and that tech that's produced is directly pipelined to the Chinese military. There's a couple things going on. Google has the Google AI Center in Beijing. It has 2 technical cooperation partnerships, one with Peking University and the other with Tsinghua University, China's 2 premier universities. And also, it's looking to put itself into a partnership with the University of Science and Technology of China, which is itself a partner in the quantum lab in Anhui province, where the Chinese military has a direct participation. So Google's tech, for those reasons alone, will be shared with the Chinese military. But there's another reason, and that is civil-military fusion, which is Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler's policy. There is no more civilian research in China when it comes to areas of technology. And Google either knows this or should know this or is trying not to know this. So while Google is working in circumstances where it knows it is aiding the Chinese military, it is refusing to do so with our military. Now, what Google is doing is despicable, but it's also legal. And it is up to 536 people to stop this. One of them is a guy named Donald John Trump. The others are 100 senators and 435 members of the House of Representatives. President Trump, by emergency order, should ban Google's cooperation that we've just described, and Congress should make that ban permanent in legislation.
It's quite the statement there, Gordon. Would that executive action? I mean, it would certainly be challenged, but is for political reasons. But is it illegal? Would it be a legal executive order?
It would be an executive order, and as you point out, Google would challenge it. But the point is, we've got to stop it, and an executive order would stop it because Google, like any other company, is not going to want to defy the President of the United States. They're going to go to court, and that's why we need a permanent legislation from Congress. But we've got to stop this immediately, and the only way to stop this immediately, Denise, is for an emergency executive order by the President of the United States. So this is not a Google issue. Yeah, they're bad. This is a Trump issue.
For a little bit of help to the listeners, we're hearing AI, and someone they get confused. AI is obviously artificial intelligence, where I would say tech companies and the telecommunications companies are throwing an awful lot of resources, an awful lot of money, because we have to compete in the realm of 5G, which is upon us. And artificial intelligence is it's not really a new concept, but it is one that is growing way past, I think, almost the ability for our own Congress to necessarily get their head around when we begin to understand the technologies that are going to be using artificial intelligence. Is that right?
Well, yes. I mean, artificial intelligence is essentially human intelligence, but in machines. And it already is in applications. So Amazon, for instance, will use this. Other businesses will use AI. And the 21st century belongs to the country that has mastered AI. So it better be us. And that's why this issue about Google cooperating with the Chinese military, at least indirectly, is critical to us. And that's why President Trump needs to deal with this.
Peter Thiel, who I think is one of the co-founders of PayPal, and he's on the board, or at least was on the board of Facebook, he made quite the declaration that there are Chinese intelligence espionage characters inside of Google, and that they need to be investigated by that, not only by the Department of Justice, by the FBI, but also CIA. And he used the word treasonous. And then I guess it also would kind of spill over into antitrust. Are we moving fast enough at all on this one, Gordon?
No, we're not. This is, I'm sure Google has Chinese spies in it, but that's not the issue, Denise. I mean, every large company, even a lot of small companies, have Chinese spies. The U.S. federal government is riddled with Chinese spies. This is an issue of the failure of Americans to deal with an obvious known danger. And there's going to be two people in history who are going to be, I think, condemned for this, certainly marked down. And their names are George W. Bush and Barack Obama, who knew about what was going on, but decided for various reasons either to take no steps or to take ineffective steps. So we have a society riddled, as you say, with Chinese spying. So this is on us. And now this is the problem of a guy named Donald John Trump, who has got to deal with this.
We know that I think Senator Rubio is probably one of the best voices and probably the most read in on all things Google and Huawei. Is anybody really listening to him? Because he gets it. He appears to me to get it. And we, Cruz earlier this week held a Senate hearing on another piece part of Google. So some attention is being paid, but we're not mobilizing these resources. That's a scary thing. I mean, it looks like, Gordon, it could take 3 to 4 years before we get any traction on this, and it's too late. Is this a timing issue?
Well, it certainly is a timing issue. And Senator Rubio and Senator Cruz, they're heroes. They have, as you say, get it. They know what to do. They have been relentless in their defense of the United States with regard to China. But unfortunately, they're not getting as much traction as they need. I think that they eventually will, because the American society will come around to this, but it is a timing issue. So, we Americans, both left and right, center as well, have to stop fighting each other and realize we've got a common enemy. And that common enemy is going to kill us if we do not protect ourselves, and that's China. So while, yes, there are a lot of important domestic issues, they pale in comparison to the common enemy that we face.
If you were to be part of a hearing and ask Google some hard questions about what they're doing when it comes to activities with the China and the Chinese military, what kind of questions would you be asking them?
Well, I'd certainly be asking the questions about what they know about the indirect benefit of their AI and other research in China going to the Chinese military. But the one question, in fact, that I have asked Google and have not gotten an answer, because I've written about this about 3 months ago, is are there Communist Party cells in, for instance, a Google AI Beijing? And that is important for us to know about the penetration of the party in, a Google entity in China.
If the United States sent Google a cease and desist on, key pieces of their international activity, what would be the first cease and desist items that you could think of?
It would be to cease and desist any efforts to develop a partnership with the University of Science and Technology of China. The second cease and desist would be their partnerships with Peking University and Tsinghua University. And the third would be to close down the Google AI Center in Beijing.
Some of these other tech companies, interestingly enough, are not going where Google has gone and is going. I just saw where Microsoft signed a fairly sizable contract with AT&T for cloud computing and artificial intelligence. So is that a message into itself that Microsoft and AT&T don't want to be any part of the China landscape?
I don't know about AT&T, but I think Microsoft also has connections in China that are something that we'll have to be looking at. Google has certainly gotten people's attention because of Peter Thiel's comments, but also, there are other U.S. tech companies there. And there's a whole issue of not only U.S. tech companies cooperating in China, but also Chinese investment into the U.S. tech sector. And that's something that we can deal with immediately because of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. All of these investments need to get approval. We can force divestiture on an emergency basis of China's investments in the U.S. There's all sorts of things that we need to do on an urgent basis. So, Google's not the only villain. It is the most prominent villain at this particular moment, but it's not the only one, Denise.
You mentioned CFIUS, which is foreign investment in the United States. I was actually over at that website the other day, and Treasury's kind of restructured that website that you can't, at least I couldn't really find some of the deals that have gone through and been approved. Once they're approved, Gordon, can we unapprove them, or can Treasury terminate them with cause?
We can undo them in a sort of ungainly, legally questionable process. But we've got to do this. And so I would recommend that we have the president by emergency order undo a number of these acquisitions. The order will be challenged in courts, but that's okay because this is something that can be patched by legislation. There's all sorts of reasons, when you start to look at these, there are all sorts of reasons that we may be able to find. So, for instance, failure on the part of the Chinese to seek CFIUS approval in certain cases. There are all sorts of legal mistakes I'm sure they made, but we should go after them. And this is something that we can do, and it's a matter of high priority. We need to get the Chinese out of our tech sector. This is going to hurt American tech innovation. There's no question about it. But the risk and the harm of having China in here is much worse. Mm-hmm. So we've got to make that balance. There are no easy choices going forward, Denise. We're going to have to do things which also in the short term harm us, but that's the price of just decades of misguided policies. And that's why I'm not very happy about those guys named Bush and Obama.
You mentioned the Chinese that are in the tech sectors, which then kind of spills over into the whole immigration debate, because we have these visas that we, pass out like crazy because, we're hearing that we don't have the tech people here in the United States to take these jobs, the Americans, and so that we have to open up, the visa pipeline to China and India. So if we replace Chinese or we terminate their visas for certain violations, are we going to be forced to open it up to other countries like India and, let's say Ecuador or wherever else you could necessarily get cheap labor? And then, China's still going to be able to back channel the espionage component.
Okay, a lot of things there that you just
I
asked.
did.
Okay, first of all, yes, of course. I mean, if we have to, first instance, go after those people, and then not all of them are foreigners. Many of them are American nationals who are spying for China.
Yeah,
and we've done a very bad job on this, and Chinese Americans have a heavy cross to bear in this regard because many of the spies are ethnically Chinese. But also, we got to remember, Denise, long term, two things. First of all, this is an American issue that we can solve with better education, especially in the STEM area. Mm-hmm. And this is on us. This is not something that foreigners are preventing us from doing. This is our failure. And the second thing, and this is long term, and that is, as George Gilder, the futurologist, has said, the great race is not for oil or water or land or whatever. The great race is for human talent. And that's going to determine who wins the 21st century, who is able to attract and build human talent. And it's going to take us a long time to rebuild our education. So in the meantime, I think that we do need to search for the best and brightest foreigners, because America's always been a beacon for people. And as people across the American political spectrum have said, America should be welcoming, especially for people who can help. So there's a lot of things that we need to do, and there's no one single solution. But obviously, long term, we've got to start educating young Americans, because we have completely failed to do that. And that, of course, is on us.
Yeah, I just saw where there was a new piece of legislation that passed the House, and there was a similar piece of legislation coming out of the Senate where we are lifting some quotas here in order to those quotas being from China or whatever rogue or competing country, because we need those skills and those educations. And sadly, they're not really addressing we can bring these people in, but you're going to end up firing Americans because of the cheaper labor. So
there's two issues there, Denise. One of them is, if you're talking about low-cost labor, yes, that is a replacement issue. But if you're talking about high tech, which is what you were asking,
mm-hmm.
People with specialized skills, that's not a replacement issue. We have an inexhaustible demand for smart people who are going to develop the technologies of the 21st century. So that's not replacing Americans. If you're talking about other labor, yes, it is. And that's a controversial issue, of course. But, what we're talking about is who develops the technology that dominates the 21st century. Who is going to develop the next Google? Who's going to develop the next Microsoft? All of these are issues where we need the best and the brightest of the world.
Why aren't these tech companies educating within their own ranks instead of going outside?
Well, they are. But as I mentioned, no company can do this on its own. And certainly when you have this voracious demand for tech, no one's going to be able to do this by themselves. So, companies are doing this, but of course we all need to do more. But that's not their issue. Companies will do what is economically necessary. They're doing the right thing. The failure here is the American public education system. That's where the real issue is. And the issue is not so much at the college level. The issue is, it starts at preschool. We're just not doing it, Denise. And that's our fault. I mean, this is not something where foreigners are preventing us from educating Americans.
Sure. It's a double-edged sword all the way around. I mean, you can't have a single channel conversation when it comes to, say, Google and China in the United States. I mean, it's a much bigger thing. It goes to education, it goes to immigration, it goes to trade. So, I mean, the conversations and the discussions are so complicated that the intersections, I don't know, are almost limitless.
Yeah. And it's very good that you are talking about these issues, because really the first step to solving them is to have an informed conversation in America about what we Americans are going to do to protect our society, what we Americans are going to do to build the society of the future.
I'm real surprised that we're not hearing more out of the FBI or Department of Homeland Security on where these things are, such that they're giving some kind of support to Cruz and Rubio. Is that by design, do you think, Gordon?
Well, this is not an FBI or Department of Homeland Security matter. This is ultimately a political matter. Okay. It starts at the top of the American political system, and it works its way through. So there is, in a society like ours, everyone is responsible for where we go, but there are more people who have more influence. So, it starts with Trump and it works its way through. And the hero, in this story are ordinary Americans like you who are talking about these issues. And, people like Rubio, who is in a position to influence, but not in a position to determine. But Rubio can't issue emergency executive orders. Right. President Trump can. And so, and President Trump has the right ideas on a lot of this stuff, but he's getting political flack going the other way, especially on issues like involving Huawei Technologies, the Chinese telecom equipment manufacturer. So this is a battle, and we need more Rubios, we need more Simons, and we need fewer of some others.
I'm kind of flattered you put me in the same sentence, but thank you for that. And then, of course, we have the all things South China Sea and, that militarization. So, God, Gordon, what a complicated deal here.
The world is complicated, Denise.
It certainly is. I was hoping you would just kind of settle it down for us and just say we got two things to focus on. But you kind of did. An executive order and education when it comes to tech and Chinese intelligence and all things artificial intelligence. I would imagine that some of these tech companies could be talking to each other too. But ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking with Gordon Chang. Thank you so much, Gordon, for kind of helping us here on this. Certainly a scary condition as you described, but we appreciate your expertise on this. And ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way, so stay with us on the Denise Simon Experience. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience, heard worldwide on Mojo 50. My friends over there at Pacific Legal Foundation tapped me on the shoulder because we have a case out in Arizona, and I think we've had a similar case someplace else, as I recall. So as a consequence, David Deerson with Pacific Legal has been kind enough to join us to talk about this poor, disabled Air Force veteran in Maricopa County. And you all know Maricopa County very well due to Sheriff Joe. But this particular sad situation has to deal with property taxes. So David's going to help us work our way through this. I don't know. I think it's a pathetic case, to be honest with you. But with that, David Deerson, welcome to the Denise Simon Experience.
Thank you very much, Denise. A pleasure.
How did this case come to the attention of Pacific Legal?
Well, so this case out of Arizona is not a case that we are providing representation for. In fact, we don't have a case like this in Arizona, but there are similar cases, although there are important differences that we'll get to, but there are similar cases happening in about a dozen states across the country. And we've been most involved in Michigan, where we've got 3 different lawsuits addressing a similar problem. We've also made some headway in Montana, where we were able to get a legislative fix to this kind of problem. And so now it won't happen again in Montana. But as you know, this is a sad story that's come out on the become a national news piece, and it's a good tie-in to talk about these other cases that we're pursuing throughout the country.
Well, what we have is Air Force veteran. How do you pronounce his last name? Boehner?
Looks like that to me. Yeah, Boehner.
Okay. Well, we'll call him Mr. Jim. Jim's his first name. Okay, so Mr. Jim is disabled. He took his life savings and he bought himself a mobile home. He lives in a mobile home park, and I think you have to kind of lease the lot that the mobile home's parked on. But you do have to pay essentially a property tax. And he's, of course, on limited income. He'd been paying his property tax up until, I guess, a year or so, maybe 2 years ago. And then all of a sudden, the sheriff started showing up, kind of giving him some warnings that he had to pay some late taxes of $236, which he thought he did when he went over to the property tax system online. And I guess that's where things completely went sideways, and his property ended up being auctioned. And now he's in a time crunch. What's particularly interesting about this one, David, is I guess the county or the state of Arizona treats mobile homes, property taxes, and property tax procedures and / auctions very differently than they do to brick and mortar houses property,
That's
correct?
Right. That's right.
Well, that's nuts.
Well, it's interesting. There's actually, it's kind of a pros and cons situation, because let's start with the con. The bad thing, if you own a mobile home, it's treated as personal property, and you have far fewer procedural protections. You're entitled to less notice. You have a much smaller window to try and redeem your property, so it's much easier to lose if your property is classified as personal property, as Mr. Jim's mobile home would be. The pro is that at the very least you'll get the surplus from the sale back, and so Mr. Jim owed about $236, and the property sold for $4,400, and at least according to the Arizona tax code, he's entitled to the difference between that $4,400 and the $236 that he underpaid. Now, if this had been real property, if this had been a home, he wouldn't get that difference back. That difference would go to a private developer, and he'd be left totally with nothing. which is that's the case that we're seeing all over Michigan, for example, and it happens in Arizona too. Now, I'm not saying that he's made whole just because he gets some of that money back.
Correct.
The his trailer's worth a good deal more, I would suspect, than the $4,400 that it was bought for at auction. In fact, he paid a couple of dozen thousand for it. So I'm not saying that he's made whole just because he gets this small sum back, but what I am saying is that the situation would be even starker if it had been a home. So for example, Pacific Legal Foundation filed a case in Detroit, Wayne County, Michigan, just last Tuesday morning, and there the Perez family are our clients. They underpaid their taxes on their home by $140, $140, and the county took the home, sold it for $108,000, and kept every penny. Over 200 times more than what they were owed, and this was the life savings for the Perez family. So now their whole life savings, the $60,000 they put into the house, 3 years of hard labor that they spent fixing the place up, it's just all gone into the county coffers. And it's a similar situation, but a little different in Arizona, where.
Hold it. No, it's okay. Is this Perez house? Did it have a mortgage on it?
No, there was no issue with the mortgage. All
right. Well, at least there's that. Okay. So go ahead with poor Mr. Jim here.
Right. So the situation's really funky in Arizona, where the county's not going to keep. If it were real property, the county wouldn't sell it at auction for whatever it's worth and keep every penny. They'd sell it for the amount of the tax delinquency. And so, let's pretend that the Perez house wasn't in Michigan and was in Arizona. Instead of the county pocketing that $107,000 in equity, it would be the private investor, because he would have been able to get title to the house for only $150. That's how it works in Arizona. It's just a massive transfer of wealth from a property owner to a private investor. But again, that's for real property, and that's not what's going to happen to Mr. Jim.
In the case of Mr. Jim, because they consider a mobile home private property and not, real property, if you will, or real estate property, is that because a mobile home is, you don't own the land?
Well, I mean, that's part of it, but
Okay.
if you'd bought an apartment, you wouldn't own the land underneath in it. It would still probably be considered
True
real
enough.
property.
Okay, good point.
I think real distinction is that theoretically you could move it out of state. So if the mobile home was fixed, movable, it might be treated as real property. And listen, this is this is a law that makes sense when we're talking about a car, like a vehicle or horses or something. But if you're living in a structure as a home, it ought to be treated as a home. And there's no reason why Mr. Jim should not have been entitled to all of the procedural protections that real property owners are entitled to.
Well, I am reminded, and you're the lawyer here, I am reminded that private citizens cannot use the excuse that if a law is broken, they weren't aware of it, or they didn't comply with some kind of a statute. They get in trouble because they weren't aware of it. In this particular case, however, it appears that he was aware and attempted to take those steps, but it's a very bureaucratic system that he wasn't able to navigate. He thought that he could navigate, but not only was there the online system, but he was getting bad information, it appears, from the people that he spoke to at the tax office or the call center that they have, which is not really necessarily a call center. It just kind of throws it into whoever's working in the tax office that day. So in this particular case, he may not have known all of the law, but at least he made a good faith effort to stop this process, and nobody at that tax office was giving him the tools to protect his property, correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. You're right that ignorance of the law is no excuse. That's something that usually comes up in the criminal context. But here the government is required by law to notify people when they're in delinquency, and it's required to take the payments and tell people correct information. And it seems like perhaps, unfortunately, unsurprisingly, Mr. Jim just ran into a faceless bureaucracy, as you said, got a bunch of conflicting messages, and the local government entities didn't do a very good job informing him of what was happening. In fact, I believe that the county Treasurer Flora, is quoted as saying something like, "We can't even figure out exactly how this happened. So, how's he expected to figure it out?" And we see this with the tax foreclosure process all over. We see this kind of sloppiness and this unnecessary confusion and obfuscation. And I suspect it's because the incentives that are created by these kind of tax foreclosure regimes, they incentivize local governments not to be very diligent in following through on these procedural protections, because either the county or a private developer stands to make a massive profit when somebody like Mr. Jim makes a simple mistake, a small mistake of, a $200 mistake. Somebody's going to profit from that mistake. And so it's not surprising that these local governments, which as we know are already can be difficult to deal with and can be Kafkaesque, it's not surprising that it's even worse in this scenario where people stand to profit off of innocent mistakes.
There's actually another, before I get to my other question, I would imagine that there's a report, because I think in most places across the country, the tax assessor is an elected position, but set that aside. But the tax assessor or the tax office director person, the head person, would likely get a monthly report that says these are the number of properties that are in trouble, that are in arrears. This is how much time they're in arrears, if it's a year, 2 years, whatever that is, and this is the monies owed. So, didn't somebody have some common sense to kind of look down there and see that Mr. Jim is in trouble for $236? Well, the answer to that is yes, because the sheriff went out to his house twice. And he still tried to negotiate and the system, finesse the system, and wasn't able to. So the $236 up until the day that the property went to auction was still sitting there, such that, okay, this is the auction day. We don't take like one more look at it.
Right. Yeah, it's wild, and of course, Mr. Jim would have paid this if he knew about it. In fact, he tried to pay it, and
he tried to pay it.
He tried to pay it, and it's the same thing with our cases in Michigan, where going back to the Perez family, they'd owned the house since 2013, and they'd paid their taxes in full. 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, they paid in full, except unknowingly they underpaid 2014 by $150. Now these people like the Perez's and people like Mr. Jim, they're not trying to get away with anything.
Right.
They're not trying to hide anything from the county. They're just trying to go about their lives and be productive citizens. But again, when somebody stands to profit from these small mistakes, they'll be pounced on.
Well, we have a new twist in this whole thing. And this new twist is the man who ended up buying the mobile home at auction has apparently a criminal record, and gave an alias. Now, I would almost think that we would kind of go, wait. The tax assessor, the sheriff, and a whole bunch of other people ought to be necessarily looking at this, because maybe we need to be asking this purchaser where he came by the money, if that was a legitimate source where he bought the mobile home. Is that just too bad, so sad?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know too much about his personal situation. I don't know if there's any reason to suspect that the money is illegitimate. But it's funny you mentioned criminal records, and I just think the system is so ripe for and rife with corruption. And to go back to the Michigan case, the county treasurer there was actually up for a disciplinary ethics hearing because in some cases his family members were buying up these properties that he was taking advantage of for people's mistakes on. It's just so ripe for corruption. It really screams out for a solution, which is what one of the state judges there in Michigan said, called it theft that calls out for relief. And I completely agree. And by the way, I want to mention to any listeners that, if anything like this has happened to you, you can go to pacificlegal.org, and we'd love to hear about it. We'd love to talk to you and look into it.
Well said. Now, in the case of Mr. Jim, poor Mr. Jim, are we, it has made national news, for sure. And I think, in the last week or so, has this thing has there been some kind of a stay, if you will, on this transaction? So, between the county, the tax assessor's office, and the procedures and the law, is it all kind of being reviewed? So this Mr. Payne person, who apparently Payne or Patron, whatever name he gets to go by, the purchaser, he's been put on ice until they kind of get through some things.
Yeah, that's right. I think because this has become a national news story and there's a light been shined on it, I think these officials down in Arizona are a little embarrassed. And I do think they're scrambling to try to find some way to undo this. In fact, I think one of them even made the offer that he'd buy the property back himself and give it to Mr. Jim. So they're certainly feeling the heat. And now that the pressure's on, perhaps they'll do a bit of a better job figuring out what went wrong and what they can do about it, because I think they'd like this to go away. And I think very likely, again, I'm not, and neither is Pacific Legal Foundation, representing Mr. Jim in any kind of official capacity, but I do think it looks like there's very potentially due process violations all over this thing. And I don't think that the local governments want a lawsuit. I don't think that they want all this national heat and attention. So we'll see how it goes. But it is true that they're scrambling to see what they can do.
The purchaser actually didn't purchase it in either his real name or his alias name. He purchased it in the name of a business, Advanced Dynamic Energy Limited. Has anybody checked to see if that's really a legitimate business?
Oh, not that I know, but it's a good question. It's certainly worth a little background research.
Yeah. Well, I guess you could this purchaser has, I think he's upped the game here, because now I think they've kind of gotten contentious between the purchaser and poor Mr. Jim, to the point where I think the purchaser wants substantially more money to undo this thing and kind of settle it back to poor Mr. Jim for something like $30,000, which would be...
That's right. Yeah, that's a great point. He purchased it, I think, for about $4,500, and Mr. Jim offered $5,000, give the guy a profit on it, but he said no, he wants $30,000, and apparently later he upped that number to $52,000. Asking for $52,000 on the house that he got for $4,500, And, meanwhile, Mr. Jim doesn't have anywhere else to go. As you said, he's a disabled veteran. He can't work because of injuries that he sustained in the course of service. So it is an incredibly frustrating situation.
Well, it looks like poor Mr. Jim, he was working very hard to work with the purchaser. I'll do this, I'll do that, come in the house, I mean, he's trying to be kind, hoping that, this purchaser would have some kind of, I guess kind of a moral posture on this whole thing. But now yeah, that's a good word. But let me ask you, I would think a GoFundMe page needs to necessarily show up to go, raise $52,000 to go pay this extortion now. I mean, from $4,500 to $30,000 to $52,000, it's almost gotten to be extortion, hasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly looks that way. And yeah, I think, if the local government can't manage to get their act together and fix this, that would certainly be an inspiring story if people came together to try to get this property back. But I just want to I just want to emphasize, it's not necessary to take an entire mobile home to pay off a $230 debt. I mean, you can bring him to small claims court. You can sell off smaller items of personal property. It's excessive to come in and take the whole thing when you're owed such a small part of it. And that's a really old principle of fairness when it comes to property law, and it's even reflected in the Magna Carta from 1215. And that's what really strikes me is that governments in states like Arizona and Michigan, they're doing things that would have made the King of England blush in the Middle Ages.
Good point. Very, very, very good point.
Somebody said to me, when I was talking about this case, when we were launching it launching the Perez case in Detroit, somebody said to me, a private lender couldn't do this. The bank can't take your whole house and keep everything to satisfy a small debt. Only the government can do this. And I thought, well, I suppose a private lender could. The only private lender I know that does things like that is called the mafia. I mean, it really is just crooked theft.
I know in some places, and I was hoping that this may be true. You did mention it, so I'll ask. In the case of a property tax, in this case, $236, whatever the number is, $500, the neighboring property often gets a tax notice that says, hey, your next door neighbor is in default. We're giving you first right of refusal to pay the $236. That, yeah, I know that happens in the state of Florida. That probably isn't the case in Arizona on this because it's not considered real property; it's considered personal property.
Yeah, that would be my best guess. I'm not an expert on the Arizona tax code, particularly except when it comes to this small issue about the tax lien sales on personal property. But yeah, I don't know of anything like that.
I'm still real disturbed about this purchaser. I'm looking at his criminal rap sheet that says includes felonies for aggravated assault, misconduct involving weapons, endangerment, along with misdemeanors for driving under the influence and shoplifting. Swell guy.
Yeah, that's a nice list. Santa Claus is happy with that one, I think.
So we're in a poor holding pattern here for Mr. Jim, aren't we?
What's that?
We're in a holding pattern for Mr. Jim to see what happens.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we'll keep an eye on it. As I said, I think the local government's pretty embarrassed. I think they want to make this thing go away. I'm not sure if they'll be able to pull that off. So it's certainly worth continuing to follow as events develop.
But if for nothing else, if the county or the tax assessor's office or whatever it is finds themselves that it's too bureaucratic and, as you said, it's too confusing for even them, I'm sure that they've got some kind of I don't want to call it a slush fund because that's got a bad connotation, but a petty cash fund that they could necessarily take some monies out of there and make it as a charity donation to help out poor Mr. Jim. Would that be unreasonable?
Could be. Yeah, I think, as I said, some of the officials were even talking about offering to pay it themselves if they can't figure out a way to cancel the thing because of the procedural irregularities. That would be a nice way to buy a little goodwill.
Yeah, he owned this property outright. He didn't have any kind of a loan on it. Is that right?
Right.
So, I mean, if he has to go, there's some chatter that he could go live with his parents or something. He and a cat, but that would be that would be a very tough situation. Well, you know, it's sad that we have to have a case like this in Arizona, but as you said, Arizona is not exclusive. You got a handful of states that do this kind of thing. So
about a dozen.
We're hoping that maybe Pacific Legal can force some new legislative processes in some of these court decisions. Is that possible?
Yes, absolutely. That's the plan. I mean, we aim to fix the problem in Michigan, and hopefully it won't take too much longer. And we're happy to work with state legislatures to change this at the legislative level. I mean, that would be great, and it would save everybody a lot of time and hassle and money from having to go to court. So if any state legislators out there are listening and want to learn how they can fix this problem, or if their state is one of the problem states, they ought to give us a call or go to pacificlegal.org. But you know, if the legislature is not going to fix it, that's exactly what the courts are for, to say, hey, this is unfair, it's unjust. In a lot of cases, it's a constitutional violation. So taking a property without paying for it, it's an excessive fine and an excessive punishment. And as I said, it violates these basic principles of fairness that the law has recognized going back 800 years.
Well, maybe Pacific Legal can write a letter over there to the Maricopa County Tax Assessor's Office and say, stop it, fix it.
Yes, ma'am. We'll do what we can.
I know you will. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking with David Deerson of Pacific Legal Foundation. Very happy we could have this discussion because I've seen this now, I think on USA Today. I've seen this case on MSN Network. Arizona Central did a TV spot about it. It's written in the newspaper. Obviously, it came to the attention of Pacific Legal, too. So, yeah, maybe from a national embarrassment standpoint, there can be some additional pressure. But Mr. David, thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience and helping explain some of these conditions, because this one's a particularly sad one. Not
Thank
that
you so
they
much.
all aren't, but yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
And ladies and gentlemen, it's been fun having you along with us on the Denise Simon Experience, and we'll see you again very soon.